work is mostly on migration. I'm a lawyer, and I'm sorry, that's my limitation. So I had to do some work to find something to say about populism. I've been using the term for quite some time because populism and migration have been associated for over a decade. But I had never really researched what it actually meant. And so I had to do some research, which was actually very interesting because my intuitions as a lawyer actually matched some of the definitions. And I chose the definitions of populism that actually matched what I wanted to say, as we so often do. But I think there are correlations which are actually very interesting. And you asked several questions combining, for example, the local level, national, international level. On migration, this issue comes regularly. What are triggering events of populism? Well, again, migration has had a role to play in that. Established parties. We've seen how on many issues, many centrist or mainstream parties have had to navigate the words, navigate the policies on migration issues. So, and are there counter movements? Well, on migration, we'll see there are silver linings. So, let me start, as you did, by a definition. And I found one definition, that's the first part of it, Inglehart and Norris, 2016. And I'll read it with you because it's quite heavy, but it contains lots of elements that I'll be able to use going on. So, a loose political ideology. So we've seen that probably several elements of ideologies are put together, that's why it's loose. Emphasizing faith in the decent, ordinary little people. You had mentioned pure people, so we're on the same term, over the corrupt political and corporate establishment. We're exactly in line with what you were saying. Nationalist interests, us, over cosmopolitanism, cooperation across borders. Then, UN bashing is very often a populist theme. Protectionist policies regulating movement of trade, people and finance over global free trade. We'll probably have something on these issues tomorrow. Xenophobia over tolerance of multiculturalism. This is in part what I'll be talking about. Strong individual leadership over diplomatic bargaining and flexible negotiations. It seems that the clear message of one person is understood better than complex negotiations which come with often contradictory statements, etc. Isolationism in foreign and defense policies over international engagement, withdrawing from international agreements such as the Paris Accord. Traditional sex roles for women and men over more fluid gender identities and roles, and traditional over progressive values. I think this gives a list of elements that we can relate to what we've read in the papers over the past 10 to 10 years. That's the follow-up. That's the next paragraph. It's the same definition that continues. The cultural cleavage between divides populism from cosmopolitan liberalism, which favors, and so that's the anti-populist attitude, the free flow of people, ideas, capital, and cultures across national borders, and pluralistic forms of governance based on respect for the protection of minority rights and checks and balances in decision-making process. That's very interesting for the lawyer. That relates more to law and constitutional law in particular. So that's what I found, and that relates quite well to several issues we have on migration. The authors continue with trying to find the two distinct drivers of populism, the economic inequality perspective and then the anti-multiculturalism perspective. The economic inequality perspective comes, and there I really speak under your control because that's totally political science and I'm not competent in that field, so I offer this for discussion. I don't pretend to understand fully what I'm talking about. But certainly the economic changes in the post-industrial economies, the loss of employment, delocalization of industrial activities. Rising economic insecurity, certainly the social welfare system has been fragilized, offers less guarantees, pensions now depend on market performance, and so you can have more or less depending on what the market can offer. Social deprivation, the idea of left behinds, people who feel that they have not benefited from progress in the past years, and especially those who are at the bottom of the economic scale, low-wage, unskilled workers, long-term unemployed, household dependent on shrinking social benefits, residents of public housing. We've had this horrible fire in London recently. Single parents, families, poor white populations living in inner cities areas. These are people who have been the victims of economic change and have not found a ladder to continue climbing up economically and socially. And therefore they are susceptible. And I must say, that's the paragraph that annoys me, because to say that therefore they are susceptible to the anti-establishment, nativist and xenophobic scaremongering is probably going a bit fast, but I still left it there for our collective reflection. It is also in this often poorer group of the population that people happen to know migrants as neighbors, as friends, and are often more open to multiculturalism than in other part of the population. So I'm less comfortable with that element of that perspective. The cultural backlash perspective says that it's not purely economic, and we've seen that in the hardline anti-immigration, change in values, the issue of what it is to be British. For example, Britishness, the definition of Britishness, etc. All these debates have also contributed to Brexit, to populism. It's a reaction against progressive cultural change and it's again here very much something about perception. They sense decline, reject rising tide of progressive values, resent the displacement of familiar traditional norms, the idealized life on the homestead when I was young. And that's not possible anymore because things have changed and all these migrants, etc. So you have that as well. I like the idea of a counter-revolutionary retro-backlash, especially among the older generation, white men, less educated sectors, in particular with what I call the rights revolution. We've had, over the past 40 years, what I call a rights revolution, be it in Europe with all the case law of the European Court of Human Rights, now the European Court of Justice as well as national courts, constitutional courts, Canadian Supreme Court. All these courts have developed a huge case law, a huge doctrine of human rights, which has very often limited the capacity of parliaments to adopt this or that policy. And that is also part of the resentment. I'll come to that in a minute. So I thought that gives sort of a political science landscape for which, again, I'm not very competent, but it sort of gives the landscape for what I'm going to speak about in terms of migration policies and law. Populism, and that was mentioned in your definition as well, government by the masses here, and it was mentioned in my definition by Engelhardt. It's a challenge to contemporary democratic governance. Majority rule is the only legitimizing mechanism that populists will recognize. It's majority rule. And this was particularly well expressed by André Leniel, who was a French socialist politician in 1981 during a debate about the nationalization that François Mitterrand introduced upon being elected president. And he said to the minority right-wing MPs who were trying to prevent the nationalizations, he said, "You are legally wrong because you're politically in the minority." And I think that that expresses very well, I think, the idea of the majority rule. Majority rules, majority is always right. Populists don't like accountability mechanisms that will tell the majority that they're wrong. They don't like courts and tribunals that will prevent them from doing things. I mean, how Trump has reacted to the various courts that prevented the travel ban and other of his initiatives. National human rights institutions, we see how the National Human Rights Institution of Australia has been rebuked by the Australian government when it has, for example, done a report on the treatment of migrant children in Nauru and Papua New Guinea. And it really was rebuked by the government and saw its funding slashed as well. They don't like ombudspersons, they don't like international organizations coming to tell them what to do. The special rapporteur on the right to food went to Canada a few years back, and every day there was a government minister asking why the UN hunger specialist came to Canada where there's no hunger problem, and why are we spending the Canadian taxpayers' money in such futile adventures. When in Canada we have an obesity crisis and we have malnutrition in Aboriginal communities. There were serious problems. But the government was pushing back by saying, you know, UN bashing, etc. And they contest the legitimacy of the human rights principle. The human rights central principle in the doctrine of human rights is that one person can tell the majority that they're wrong. It's about the human rights of everyone and anyone. And that is something that populists don't like. We've seen it. For example, we have a very well-known columnist in the Globe and Mail, which is a newspaper in Toronto, who still has not accepted the Singh decision of the Canadian Supreme Court of 1985, that's 32 years ago, saying that an asylum seeker could ask for and obtain from the Supreme Court of Canada that the whole chapter of the Immigration Act about asylum claims and refugee determination is unconstitutional. Mr. Singh obtained that, the declaration of inconstitutionality of the whole refugee determination system. And that means that one uninvited guest could obtain the invalidity of what the majority of the people, the representatives of the majority of the people had decided. Some people don't accept that. And this is a rejection which is important because it is a rejection of the post-war democratic architecture. The experience of the 30s is that majorities can be wrong and that we need to limit them into what they do well, which is to discuss social issues and come up with solutions. But we have to put limits to what they do. And we've done that through two other pillars of democratic governance these days: the rule of law, which I define with others as the capacity of anyone to go and challenge any decision made that affects their rights, and the human rights regime, which protects anyone against violation of their rights. And so those three are the three pillars of democratic governments today. Australia can put people in Nauru and Papua New Guinea because it doesn't have a constitutional or legal guarantee of human rights. There's one pillar missing. There's the rule of law. There are traditional human rights guarantees based in the common law that Australia has inherited, but they don't have a European Convention on Human Rights. They don't have a Canadian Charter of Rights. And as long as Parliament is clear, that's one, that's only 10, okay, good, thank you. As long as the Parliament is clear, it cannot be defeated by courts, because that's the will of the people. And so we have very often denunciation of any criticism. Our minister, Jason Kenney, has been very famous. He was a minister of immigration in Canada under the Conservative government. He was very famous for telling his electorate in partisan meetings, you know, railing about those unelected judges that were trying to prevent me from protecting you. And That's really the populist discourse, the reaction against the limitation of the power of the elected person who benefits from the legitimacy of the majority vote. And that's a problem we have. We are electoral democracies, and electoral democracies have relied on electoral incentive. It's the electoral mechanism which decides, which pushes politicians to do this and that. When politicians smelling the wind see that environmental issues are up in the air, they will start adopting environmental friendly policies in order to get the approval of the electorate and get elected, and especially re-elected, because that's the most difficult test. The problem we have, and that's a structural problem of electoral democracies, is that migrants don't vote. Migrants don't vote, and yet migrants, and I say this in this country where a quarter of the population doesn't vote, migrants don't vote, yet they pay taxes, they obey the law. No taxation without representation is something that I've been discussing with Thomas for a number of years, and they have no say in how the taxes are spent. They have no say in how the laws are adopted. So they cannot reward or punish politicians. They're politically invisible, non-existent. And this is a problem we have. They're electorally invisible, non-existent, but politically, in a larger way, they're also non-existent because they don't protest, they don't contest, they don't go to court, they don't unionize very often. Many of them, and I'm not necessarily speaking about the privileged migrants, who are not called migrants, by the way, they're called expats. Language matters, I'll come back to that. The migrants who are vulnerable, undocumented migrants, temporary migrant workers with precarious contracts, these people have a migration project which they have created very often with their family, with their village. Much has been invested. Economies have been put together, savings have been put together in order to fund something. And they've given often a lot of time and energy to get somewhere, to find some place where they can send money back home, provide a future for their family, provide a future for their children. And so being sent back home empty-handed is simply not an option. If protesting, contesting, going to courts, unionizing risks making the whole migration project flop, that's not what they're going to do. That's not what they're going to do. The best strategy for most migrants when they are in a precarious situation is to move on. You haven't been paid for 3 months. You discreetly leave on Friday evening your job, and on Monday morning you've found another job and you forget about the pay that you haven't been paid. We would go to court for those 3 months, but very often they don't. And this is structural. They don't vote, they don't influence the vote. We had that problem in the 19th century when you had a wealth criteria to be able to be part of the electorate. You had to have no debts, for example. That was in the 1840s, 50s, 60s. You had to have no debts to be able to vote, and many people had debts. And therefore, and this is something that, for example, women, gays and lesbians, persons with disabilities know very well. Only when they have started actively to use their vote as citizens and to contest, protest, push politicians to do something, threaten politicians of not voting for them, that they've been able to change the political parties' programs. They have been able to change the language of the politicians today. For most people, not all politicians, but most politicians, doing a sexist joke or a homophobic joke is actually not good for your electoral prospects. That has changed because women have gone to the fore, because gays and lesbians have fought for changing the stereotypes, because they could do so based on their request for equal citizenship. Migrants can't do that. It's not going to happen anytime soon. And so for many migrants, for many politicians, defending migrants' rights, speaking publicly in favor of migration is not an option. You don't win votes by doing this when the populists will win vote by doing migrant bashing. And the good example is Alain Juppé recently in the French primaries. Alain Juppé spent 1 year in exile in Montreal after problems with courts in France before coming back to politics. And during that year, he learned quite a lot, and we worked with him. He was in another university, but we did all sorts of things with him. It was interesting. He learned a lot about multiculturalism and immigration, and etc. And in the primaries on the right in France during the last electoral campaign, he refused to do migrant bashing, while François Fillon came in the race quite late and immediately did migration bashing and said he would close the border, he would do this, that. And Alain Juppé refused to do it, and that was the end of his career, basically. He was the front runner, and within 2 weeks, it was over. And that's an interesting element. And it comes to something you had mentioned before here. So we have, because of that, we have totally irresponsible political discourses on migration. Not because politicians are inherently irresponsible, some of them are, but most of them are not. But because there's no responsibility for what you're saying, because there's no constituency out there that will vote against you if you say something like that. So you can say, like Jean-Marie Le Pen 30-odd years ago, 2 million immigrants, 2 million unemployed. Making a stupid equation, but which totally resonates still today when his daughter talks about migrants and unemployment in the same sentence, making the same connection. And that is the kind of stereotype that should have disappeared and doesn't, because there's no pushback. So we have a nationalist populist discourse based on constructed myths, stereotypes, that go uncontradicted. There's no one at the political level. For sure, we work and we do papers and research, economic research, political research, legal research, that shows the contrary. But that does not get to the political level. One exception, I said, except partly in the US. In the US, you have a huge, probably 40 million population of American citizens of Latino origin who vote. And they're actually interested in what happens to the undocumented, who are also Latino and Mexican, many of them Central Americans. They're interested. And what the government does to the Latinos, actually, to the undocumented, actually the Latino vote reacts. So there is a more balanced debate about migration policies. We've seen that it has not swayed the last election, but there is a more robust debate. You will see the Pew Center studies, the Migration Policy Center in Institute in Washington Studies, quoted and being presented. But very often in countries, I'm following France in particular, for example, or even the United Kingdom, you very rarely see the statistical reports about migrant contribution, job creations, etc., being quoted in the political debate. You will see them in our journals, yes, for sure. But that doesn't reach the political stage, doesn't reach the mainstream media very often. Although it's better, I'll come to that. And words matter. We talked about words just before, the use of words. We often use liquid language to talk about migrants. And I give quite a number of examples here. Flows, waves, tides, floods, trickling, streaming in, swelling, pouring, seeping, pooling, drowning. We're drowned over, and we need to contain. I mean, all those words convey the meaning of a mass of things out there which is threatening. The wave, the tsunami wave. Jean-Marie Le Pen used the example of the marabunta. The marabunta is this red ant column in the Brazilian forest that eats everything on its path. You know, you can't stop ants, you know, it's millions of them. There's no individuality. There's no humanity. It's a mass. It's toxic waste. It's sludge. That's the image it projects. And I find myself using refugee flows regularly, and then I tell myself, don't. Refugee movements, yes. But we do that, and it means something. And yet, something which is never really discussed, and certainly not in the populist presentation of migration issues, is that migrants' precariousness is constructed, and mostly constructed by us, countries of destination. Populists, and not only populists, because those who want to be elected instead of populists will use the same images, politicians will very often point to the push factors of migration. Oh, they are fleeing misery, they're fleeing violence, conflict, etc. And I mean, we are, you know, oasis of prosperity and decency, and so they want to invade and bring their problems onto us. I mean, this is the image that is projected. We never discuss, frankly, about the reasons why most migrants want to go to Germany and not to Portugal or to Latvia. Most people want to go to Germany, refugees and other migrants, because there are jobs. Because there are jobs to be had in the UK, in Germany, in the Netherlands, in Denmark, in Sweden. There are other elements. Sweden announced that they would protect every Syrian as a refugee, and that was a major pull factor. And they decided it very courageously, hoping the rest of Europe would follow. Angela Merkel said, "Wir schaffen das," and hoping the rest of Europe would follow. And those two very courageous countries and politicians were not followed. So these were pull factors. But the general pull factor is labor market. Labor market in the official, above-counter labor market, if you're migrating in a regular way, as a temporary migrant worker, for example, from Nepal to Qatar, to Doha, or underground labor markets in our northern economies. And those markets benefit, thank you, incredibly from the low labor cost of very precarious migrant workers, be they undocumented or be they temporary migrant workers. If we talk about undocumented migrants, we always talk of them coming and steal jobs. That's what we hear. But we never talk about the hundreds of thousands or millions of employers, nationals, who are actually benefiting, whose businesses are being more competitive because of their low labor costs. They are the exploiters. They are committing a criminal act. And yet, that's not repressed, or very little. We hear from time to time in the US of a raid on a meat packing plant, but that's just the tip of the iceberg. There's very little interest in repressing what we should call, you know, we talk about illegal migrants or undocumented migrants. We should talk about illegal employers, and we never do. There's a trend of criminalizing the migrants with very little criminalization of the employers who do the exploitation. And this comes from, I mean, very quickly, and many of you are much better equipped to deal with that, we've delocalized the working conditions to the north. And the more we repress the migrants, which is what most of our countries are doing, by arresting and detaining migrant workers when they're working undocumented, to repress that is to push them further underground, further into the hands of the smugglers, the recruiters, the unscrupulous employers. And we actually increase the power of smuggling rings and exploitative employers. When we should do the contrary, we should fight the employers and free the voice of the employees who are, although undocumented, are exploited, and we should allow them to speak up, to claim that they are being exploited and that the real culprit is not them, but the employer, and we're not doing this. That's the idea from zero tolerance to harm reduction. This comes from a colleague of mine, Desmond Manderson, who is at National Australian University in Canberra, who wrote a very fine article comparing the war on drugs with the war on undocumented migrants, and saying that the comparison is very clear. The war on drugs has not succeeded at changing any of the drivers of drug consumption, production, and smuggling, and only when you legalize, regulate, and tax can you change such behaviors. We've done this for the Prohibition era, at the end of the Prohibition era, about alcohol. We're now doing it slowly about drug and providing safe injection sites, not criminalizing, reducing harm. And this is something that we'll have to do for undocumented migration. We'll have to allow the voice of the migrants to come up and to reduce the fear of speaking up against exploitation. Temporary migrant workers, they have a legal status, but that legal status is so restrictive, so precarious, that they don't speak up. They don't dare saying anything wrong by fear of being fired. Because if you're fired and you're under the kafala system or sponsorship system, not only do you lose your job, but you lose your work permit and your residence permit, and you're sent back home. And so we have temporary migrant workers which are intended to shape the employer-employee relationship so that the employer can extract the maximum work from the employee for the minimum cost. And we could change those policies. Canada has a sponsorship system with one employer, which is why so many people in the Gulf states, for example, are exploited. And we have that same system in Canada for a small number of employees, for example, in extraction in mines out west. And voices have been raised against that, but it hasn't yet reached policymakers. The human rights speech has little traction. I'm going to go into, again, a field of academe that I don't master at all, which is social psychology. I've read Jonathan Haidt, The Righteous Mind, which is a very interesting book that doesn't talk much about migration, but talks about politics and religion in the US mostly. But what Jonathan Haidt has said about how people make moral decisions is actually very interesting to understand the populist reaction regarding migration. He says, and I mean, don't take that for granted, go read Jonathan Haidt, and don't shoot me because I'm just repeating what he says and I'm not trying to understand everything he says, but bear with me. We make moral decisions with our emotions. 90% of our moral decisions are emotion-based, and then we rationalize. He uses the comparison of the elephant and the mahout. The mahout can tell the elephant to go to the left, but if the elephant wants to go to the right, there's nothing the mahout can do. That's the relationship between emotions and reason when we make our moral decisions. And there are 6 moral criteria for moral decision: freedom, fairness, care, authority, loyalty, and sanctity. Don't ask me why. I don't know. This is very interesting. He divides the world on a spectrum between conservatives and liberals. So you have, it goes from one end to the other of the spectrum, which probably we could, use liberal cosmopolitanism to populist, ultra-populist. We could use the same type of. And he says that liberals use 3 criteria: freedom, fairness, and care. Conservatives use all 6 criteria. And the human rights discourse is typically a liberal discourse. It talks about freedom, fairness, and care. It doesn't answer the authority, loyalty, and sanctity issues that are important for conservatives. And I thought that's very interesting. It applies to migration issues quite neatly. Undocumented migrants, if we take the case of undocumented migrants, they've come irregularly into the country or have stayed irregularly in the country. They have challenged the authority of the law. They have challenged the authority. They have violated the law. And therefore, they have breached the issue of authority. They are a threat. There's a security issue. The undertone is security trumps human rights in that view. Loyalty is about citizenship. Citizens can be presumed loyal. Foreigners have to demonstrate that they are. If you enter illegally or stay illegally, well, you demonstrate that you're not loyal. So human rights are actually citizens' rights in the populist mind. And charity, that's very interesting. When he talks about sanctity, faith-based organizations, churches, have been quite good on refugees and migrants, generally. They've supported the sanctuary movement. The Pope has talking about protecting refugees. They've been quite good. But all this is based on charity, not on rights. It's because we are good Christians. It's because we are good Jews. It's because we do the right thing. Not because they have the right to be protected, or they have the right to work, or whatever. And so that, to me, was an explanation why, when I explained why everyone has rights, including migrants, including undocumented migrants, except two, the right to vote and be elected, the right to enter and stay in the country, but all other fundamental rights apply to everyone, with no exception. I explain that, and I explain the details, etc., and I often get the reaction, yes, I understand, I see the logic, but I disagree. My human rights discourse, as convincing as I thought it was, simply has no traction, because I'm not answering the authority, loyalty, and sanctity issues. I have a liberal discourse, which does not answer there. So there is a more sophisticated answer from the liberal discourse, because in fact, in the human rights framework, you have the issue of authority. There are exceptions to human rights applications. Not all human rights can have exceptions, but many rights have exceptions. And there are derogations possibility, etc. But it's not very convincing for the populist mind. And so you have this dialogue of the deaf on undocumented migration. They live among us and they broke the law. And you just can't connect these two sentences. What migrants need, like every one of us, is empowerment, is the capacity to claim, the capacity to fight for our rights. And that's what women have been doing for centuries, but at least in the human rights movement for a century, fighting for equal pay, fighting for equity in the labor market, which is not necessarily equality. That's what workers, industrial workers have done. That's what people with disabilities have done, what detainees and their families have done. They have fought to have a voice, to be empowered to fight for their rights, to go to court, to have the money to go to court, to have the ability to think that they could go to court and actually win. That's the empowerment issue. And the voice of migrant, which is not heard, could change that. And we've seen in many situations that when migrants spoke up, suddenly the population changed. Suddenly there were different attitudes. One of the big results, I think, of the private sponsorship mechanism by which Canada has welcomed tens of thousands of refugees in the past year and a half, and 40 years ago, Indo-Chinese refugees. This private sponsorship system is interesting because it brings refugees and protects them and makes them into Canadian citizens quite quickly. But it's even more interesting because it engages hundreds of thousands of Canadians to fight for this family who has become friends of them, to integrate the Canadian market, to help them to go to school, go to the market, have a job, find a car, find an apartment. They've spent time, energy, money doing something for an immigrant family, and suddenly you have a constituency who will speak up for the migrants. If someone says, there are too many refugees in Canada, there will be a constituency out there saying, no, there are not enough refugees in this country. And that is, to me, the kernel of empowerment, because someone will speak up in favor of those refugees. But we know that mostly human rights are only defended by the people themselves. Women know very well, for example, that they have never been given their rights. They've wrestled their rights from our male hands. And this is what every marginalized community has experienced. And so the liberal agenda is the empowerment of migrants, the empowerment of a minority group against the majority, which is not what populists want, where the majority rules. And we can think, and I say it's an idea for the future, I never dared put that in my reports to the Human Rights Council yet, but I won't do it anymore because I'm on my way out. But we should think that any person who's been resident in the country for more than 5 years, who's obeyed the law and paid taxes, should vote. I don't see why third-generation Argentinians of Italian descent can vote for the Italian parliament, while third-generation Turks born in Germany cannot vote for the German parliament. Residency, paying taxes, participating in life, sending kids to school should empower us all to be part of the political debates about rules, about what rules our lives. But I don't think we're there yet, so let's forget about it for the moment. Let's keep it somewhere at the back of our minds, but it's in, simply because they don't trust them. And the Association of American Police Chiefs has adopted a resolution saying we should not be checking immigration papers. If we want to serve our mission, we should not be checking immigration papers. That's not our mission. ICE should do that. It's their agents who should do it. They should be well-resourced. They should be well-trained. Thank you. So this is the idea of firewalls. Cities, you've mentioned the links between local, national, and global. Cities have been excellent on migration. Cities have developed social integration policies that are accessible to everyone, including migrants. In New York, Bill de Blasio has created this ID card for all New Yorkers. That sentence has stayed in the minds of everyone. All New Yorkers. We don't care about your immigration status. You have access to our services because you live in New York. That's it. And we've seen initiatives all around the world, sanctuary cities in the late 70s and early 80s certainly, but more recently, services offered it to all migrants, and we don't need to check your access to school, access to public services, access to libraries, you're part of the community and you're going to have access to the community as anyone else. You've heard about the Global Compact on Migration. I've made last year a conference here explaining where we were, what we were going to do about the Global Compact, so I will not come back to that. I just want to make a few suggestions as to, what are the things that need to be done in that Global Compact negotiation. First of all, to me, restrictionist policies, trying to stop migration, are part of the problem and they're not part of the solution. We're not going to solve our migration problem by more repression or by trying to stop each and every one of the persons that we don't want. That's not going to happen like this. We have, I think, and that I'll come back to that, we have to open up, and this is not my own analysis, this is the analysis of a large number of people. We need to open up mobility to many more people, to create legal channels for mobility and make them accessible to many more people so that people can come and go. We have to do things at the same time, and this cannot be done in one go. It has to be done progressively, and there's a path towards that. But we have to open up mobility, making it easier. And states have actually committed to that. I'll come back to that. We very often hear states, governments, civil servants, politicians say that we need to fight the smugglers. Very nice objective, a populist objective, fight criminality, being tough on crime, etc. It's never worked. It didn't work for the smuggling of alcohol from Canada to the US during Prohibition. It's not working for the war on drugs. The cartels are as deadly as ever. It won't work for migration. The more you repress irregular migration, the more you give power to the smugglers. There was no smuggling ring between France and Italy for 20 years under the Schengen system. As soon as France put barriers in Ventimiglia, bang, an old smuggling route through the Alps reopened again, and people started walking through the mountains. It's an industry that thrives on prohibition. If you don't prohibit, you can get organized. You control, if you legalize, regulate, and tax alcohol, you have reduced considerably, not entirely, the smuggling of alcohol from the US now to Canada. It was the reverse before. But now that taxes are lower in the US, we have some smuggling to Canada. But that's how you control a crime, a criminal activity which thrives on restrictions. And so we need to take over the mobility market. That's what we've done with alcohol. That's what we are now slowly doing with drugs, and there will be restricted drugs, and there will be people who are prohibited from entering. That's not a problem. That's part of what it is to control borders. But it doesn't mean that you have to stop everyone. And so we need to do a number of things at the same time, and that's the complex part. And it's not going to happen in a few years. It's a long-haul, generational process. We need to reduce underground labor markets, and that's going to be difficult. And I often, probably I've already used here the Quebec strawberry example. I see someone smiling. Have you heard that? Not yet? No? I might have used it already. Quebec strawberries are very good in June. And they are produced using temporary migrant workers from the Caribbean and undocumented migrant workers as well, very often. Citizens and permanent residents don't go there because the salaries are too low. It's 12 to 14 hours of work per day because the strawberries are ripe now, and these are the longest days of the year. And it's on all four, and it's bug season. So when I ask my students how much should they be paid per hour in order to go there as compared to waiting at a cafe in Montreal, they say $25 an hour. That would put the little basket of strawberries at $20, and no one would buy it. So we need to reduce those underground markets, labor markets, and we need to do it smartly by starting a conversation as to how to make them competitive without exploitation, without labor exploitation. But no one has an interest. The farmer has no interest to raise the question. The mayor of the village has no interest to see the farms disappear. The MP has no interest to see the impoverishment of the rural area. The Minister of Finance is very happy to get the taxes from the farms, and the migrant workers don't complain. And they don't complain because they fear being returned. So if no one complains and everyone is happy, where's the problem? We need to start a conversation in construction, in agriculture, in fisheries, in care, in hospitality, in extraction, which are not delocalizable industries, and therefore in many countries in those sectors we have imported labor conditions from the south in the form of underground labor markets. So that's something that we need to do, which is very difficult to do when you don't have a constituency fighting for it. Migrants need to be better organized. Unions could help. We need accountability mechanisms, but for that we need that migrants come forward, make complaints. We need better data. We need to, if we do this, we will be able to reduce the costs. I mean, the wall that Mr. Trump talks about, I mean, the estimations vary considerably, but it's several hundreds of billions of dollars. I mean, this is not a productive investment. We could do much better with that. And this will be important if we want to change the nature of the public discourse. As long as we have underground labor markets where migrants steal jobs from good taxpayers, and as long as we have temporary migrant workers who are being exploited, I'm thinking of, for example, domestic workers who are being exploited and we associate migration and criminality, the populist discourse will have traction. So we need, and that's my point, we need a long-term strategic vision and planning on mobility. And that's what we miss most. What we hear from politicians is we need migrant workers now, we need to expel them now, we need Indian ITs now. It's never 10 years from now, it's 20 years from now. We do strategic planning for energy, food security, infrastructure. We never do strategic planning for migration. It's now. We're just, managing the flow, to use that sentence. And we should strategize mobility, which we're not doing. These are the 8 goals that I've proposed as my contribution to the discussion on the Global Compact. I've suggested to make a global agenda like the Agenda 2030 on sustainable